Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and welcome back to Frames of Space.
Over the past few decades, and especially in just the past decade, it has become increasingly impossible to ignore China's growing influence on the world stage. We are talking about a country that is on track to become one of the most important players in global politics and the world economy, maybe even surpassing the US in some areas. And it's not entirely speculation. Some of it is trajectory that we're seeing right now. So the question becomes, why does this matter? Why should we care? Well, if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you're someone who's curious about the world and someone who wants to understand the forces shaping our future. And understanding China, its people, its government, its economy, is absolutely essential if we want to make sense of where the world is headed. Because here's the thing. China obviously is not just a bigger version of the West. Its culture, its values, its political system, they're different. Sometimes those differences are subtle, sometimes they're huge. And that can make it hard to talk about China in a way that feels complete. But I don't see that as a problem. I see that as an opportunity. It's a chance to listen, to pay attention, and to learn. My guest today is Rana Mitter, who is a British historian and political scientist who spent decades studying the modern Chinese state, its history, its ambitions, and the way that it sees itself. He is currently the St. Lee Chair in U.S.-Asia Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. And if you've ever read his writing or heard him speak, you'll know that he brings a rare blend of historical perspective and present tense fluency. He is someone who understands China not just as a political actor, but as a civilization, shaped by war, revolution, reform, and now, by the strange contradictions of global capitalism and digital authoritarianism. This conversation ended up being about a lot of things: COVID and the Chinese middle class, AI and authoritarian coordination, and much, much more. But that big looming question behind so many of our topics was just the question of how do we talk about China in a way that presents the full nuance and balance that it deserves. What Rana tries to convey is that a lot of China resists easy storylines. Its citizens can be proud and skeptical. Its tech sector can be state-directed and wildly innovative. Its culture can be collectivist and individualistic. So if we're trying to understand what comes next, whether we're headed for a Chinese century, a multipolar world, or something more chaotic entirely, it is important for us to at least entertain the idea of living in that ambiguity to a greater extent. Hope you enjoy.
Very nice to speak to you, Andrew. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Me as well. All right, maybe a table-setting question first. What made you interested in studying Chinese history, Chinese politics, and so on and so forth?
I can't claim that there's any very obvious pathway that led me in the direction of China. I grew up in the UK in the late 80s, early 90s, when I made a decision in high school that I'd like to study Chinese. And I think that was driven by the fact that it was probably the thing that was most remote from anything that I had experienced myself. I'd never been to China, never met anyone Chinese, never learnt any Chinese, certainly. So the idea that it might be an interesting topic, I think popped into my mind at one point. And as it turns out, more than 30 years later, actually, it turns out it is a very interesting subject. So my 17-year-old instinct was not wrong.
Do you ever feel like you had to overcome potential misconceptions that you might have had, or as you studied it, you became more and more aware of how different it was to anything that you had experienced in life beforehand?
I don't think I have to come across. I don't think I have to overcome misconceptions because you have to remember that we're talking about, in 80s, 90s, that there really weren't very many conceptions about China at all. Certainly, in much of the Western world. I mean, obviously people knew where it was, broadly speaking, and they might have vaguely heard of Chairman Mao. But actually, this was not a period when this is not the period when China was obviously going to be an economic superpower. It didn't have the kind of standing that it does in the present day. Of course, one of the kind of great, flashpoint moments was the horrific killings in Tiananmen Square in 1989, which happened during my undergraduate time. That certainly shaped perceptions in a very, very stark sort of way. But in retrospect, what we've seen is that despite the horror of that particular set of killings, in fact, the period afterwards, the 1990s, ended up being relatively quite open, both in terms of economics and in terms of some of the space for civil society discourse, certainly compared to today. So perhaps that was an object lesson that historical trajectory matters. You need to look at things in the longer term as well as the immediate term.
Yeah. But I guess another one more table setting question. I do think it's very fascinating when I read you or I listen to you, and the way that you talk about Chinese politics seems very interesting to me. So just for the audience, do you feel more comfortable discussing China from like a normative lens or an empirical one? Are you here to just like state the facts and like state the trends without making moral judgments, or do you try to add moral judgment to what you say?
I don't think I make moral judgments because I'm, not sure that I'm necessarily qualified to pronounce the morality of anyone else. I think we're certainly there to make normative judgments, which is not quite the same thing. Certainly the empirics matter. I think that one of the things that is important to note is that whatever you think about China, if you look at it only through one particular dimension, you will miss the wider picture. So I think probably one of the things that I am keenest to do is that if you have, younger people whose only knowledge of China is from Chinese social media, then they need to, understand China's huge cyber and security presence, which is growing in a very important part of its state and international project. If you spend your time thinking basically just about China's nuclear missiles, then, which are also very important to think about, then maybe you should watch some Chinese TV and see what millions of Chinese people sit down every evening to watch if they're watching a drama or a comedy show. In other words, I think that if I had any one sense of what is most important for interpreting China, having a very broad ranging picture in which things which sometimes are uncomfortable for the West and sometimes uncomfortable for China are part of the mix.
Yeah, or sometimes it's the sort of thing where you don't expect it to be uncomfortable, but then you look into it and it becomes uncomfortable because you end up looking at it more deeply than you had initially looked at it. So I guess one example of this, at least to me, would be like an understanding of the Chinese government and how its citizens view it. Like, how do you take, for instance, how do regular Chinese citizens view the Chinese government, and how does that compare to the ways in which like a lot of Westerners might view like the democratic governments that they might live in?
Sure. Well, as you'll understand, with 1.2 billion people, it'd be very hard to give a generalized view of how all citizens view these issues. I would say that, starting with some obvious divisions in society, rural Chinese will often look at their government very differently from urban Chinese. Men will look at it very differently from women. People who come from ethnic minorities will look at it very differently from those who come from the Han ethnic majorities. So you can already see there are a whole variety of different divisions and issues, even within that kind of category of Chinese citizens. But broadly speaking, the best way to answer your question, I think, is to think about what tools and mechanisms do we have to actually assess those views. Well, first of all, there are opinion poll surveys. They are actually feasible in some cases in China, although they're done under highly controlled circumstances, and so one has to sort of take them with a pinch of salt. But you do see that there are certain trends which I think it's fair to say have emerged in the last few years. One is that a trend that we saw certainly for much of the 1990s and 2000s, that broadly speaking, there was reasonable comfort with the growing prosperity level in China, that, people felt that overall they were living better than their parents or grandparents. And their grandparents probably were living during the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, which was a pretty horrific time for anyone to be living in, certainly in urban China. Rural China is slightly different. And so the comparator maybe was a low floor, but nonetheless, it was a very real one. People felt that they had apartments, they had automobiles, they had a kind of middle class lifestyle. That was all coming together. I think we need to think more about perhaps the single biggest event that shocked a lot of people, particularly the urban middle class, and that was COVID. In the Western world, we've almost forgotten about COVID in some ways, probably unwisely.
I think we're like very deliberately trying to forget, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, that may be I think it's just that, human beings tend to move on, I think, quite far from huge transformative events where there isn't an obvious physical, legacy. So, when you're bombed in World War II, for instance, or World War One, where there's bombing and, war dead and those who, have limbs which have been lost in war, very visible on the streets. That brings it to mind. The influenza pandemic that followed World War One in 1919 has been much less well remembered in history, ironically, until COVID came around and people started remembering it because, many millions died. It was a tragedy, but the physical legacy was less. But going back to COVID in China, I think that there's been possibly an underestimation, because it's hard to measure, of how much that really shook large numbers of people in that urban middle class. Remember, in Shanghai, we're speaking in December of 2025. So really, less than 4 years ago, people in Shanghai were basically forced to, essentially be locked away in their apartments for weeks and weeks on end. If I remember correctly, about 7 weeks, extraordinarily long time during the kind of last phase of zero COVID policy. And I think this made a lot of people in that middle class, who actually had been very used to, in some ways, an ironic combination of Chinese life being open and closed, both at the same time, to concentrate on the closed rather than the open. Let me explain briefly what I mean by that. I think that one of the things that confuses a lot of people in the outside world, particularly in the Western world, who don't know China very well, is that because evidently there's huge amounts of censorship and control at home, and that's, I think, unarguably true, they forget that many, many Chinese are in the world, the wider world. They are studying in the West. They're doing business. They are involved in, tourism, all these sorts of things. So it's not as if Chinese people, during certainly that period had been prevented from going outside, particularly the ones who could afford to do so. But they were almost living in two worlds, one inside China where there's restrictions, and one on the outside where, if they're in the United States or if they're in Thailand or somewhere, there was much more freedom of operation. The COVID period, I think, reminded a lot of middle-class Chinese who had enjoyed those freedoms over decades, the freedom to hop on a plane and go on a holiday in Hong Kong or Thailand, the freedom to go and study in the United States, that actually those freedoms were contingent on what the government, what the party, what the state does. Now, of course, that has faded somewhat now that COVID is in the rearview mirror and China is once again opening up more clearly. But I think for an awful lot of people, that memory is still very much there. So I would say that looking at the question of COVID as an indicator of how people's relationship with the state has changed is an important element. One other thing to add, and this is something we could talk about maybe a bit further, we do, as of the last 15, 20 years, let's say, have one fabulous, really useful indicator of some part of what the Chinese public is talking about, and that's social media. Prior to social media existing, because, as we've said, of China's, top-down controls, censorship of media, press, TV, and so forth, it was hard, not impossible, it was hard to find authentic expressions of world views that weren't heavily mediated by the state. Now, don't get me wrong, Chinese social media is heavily censored in all sorts of ways, including using artificial intelligence for word search on sensitive issues. But at the same time, what's also astonishing is how much is not censored for two reasons. One is that Chinese social media is so huge that even with AI and censorship, you can't get everything all the time. And the second is a lot of people have a suspicion that China's government, China's ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, actually wants some sense of what's going on. What are people thinking? And by allowing a little bit of leeway on social media for people to complain about dodgy finance, about property, the property boom going bust, about whatever else is on their minds, they have a sense of something they can feed back into decision making. So not having total censorship, I think, is at least in part a choice alongside the very real, very top down, very authoritarian political control.
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. One thing that I thought was interesting is like the idea that a lot of Chinese urbanites, they might be a little bit like the traditional like story that you might tell would be that a lot of them are a lot more content with the closed aspects of the society, like maybe the more content with like the censorship or like suppression of freedoms because of like the way that it allows for economic prosperity within like within China, like prosperous Chinese cities. Do you think that China's like zero COVID policies, do you think they led to any kind of lasting discontentment towards the CCP?
I think a lot of people did feel very resentful, probably still do. I mean, for instance, take a specific thing, because actually, weirdly enough, because the opening up after COVID was so sudden without warning, a lot of older people died in China during that year, and people will have had grandparents and parents who, passed away during that time. Obviously, that's something that no family is going to forget. It did, though, I think, also have some important transformative effects, which are only beginning to, I think, become apparent now. When COVID shut down the world, I mean, not just China, in 2020, we were just at the beginning of what I think we now recognize as an emergent phase of the growth of artificial intelligence and the emergence of an online economy, which, essentially operates largely without physical bricks and mortar type infrastructure. That was already there, of course, but, the fact that, for instance, so many people around the world, but certainly in China, had to order food deliveries that would be, basically left outside their apartments so they could pick them up without having to kind of touch the delivery people, really boosted the idea that actually these kind of online businesses, Meituan and so forth, would have more of a presence. And then also the emergence of, earlier versions of AI, which have now become even more sophisticated, pushed forward the idea that maybe in a world, in a China, where you didn't necessarily have the option of physical labor because it couldn't physically, be around in case it caught COVID, that thinking about how technology might replace that became a more urgent issue. I think those are some of the longer term issues that were not caused by COVID, but phenomena that were accelerated by COVID, which we're now seeing the effects of, even though COVID itself is in the rearview mirror. And if you think about things like China's labor market, where lots of younger people, as in the West, are finding it difficult to get jobs and becoming often quite disillusioned about that, thinking about the interaction between technology and the labor market and how that was changed by COVID and by other factors as well, I think is one of the most intriguing phenomena of the 2020s.
Yeah, as an American citizen, I can say that like within the US, there's tons and tons of discussion about artificial intelligence, like how moral it is, how much it should be regulated, and so on and so forth. Do you think that China stands a very large chance of like outpacing the US when it comes to technological growth related to AI?
I would give you a slightly different take, and I'll be frank, frank and honest and say that I don't think this is my original take. You can find it from analysts, including recently a really interesting column by Eleanor Olcott and others in the Financial Times on the question of the AI race, if you want to call it that. And at least part of the discussion actually touched on the idea of, well, hang on. Is it a race? Is it a competition? Is it a contest? And again, there's some discussion, as I'm sure you know, in China about whether it's a bisai or a jingzheng or whichever particular term you want to use. The reason that it might be worth stopping and thinking whether this is the right metaphor to use is that there is a strong sense that what China as an ecology, meaning the party, the private sector companies, which of course are heavily directed by the party's interests, if not, not literally a command economy, as opposed to the US, are seeking to do with artificial intelligence. So to take one example, one of the goals of American AI, and I'm talking in the kind of broad sense of when you get, the zillionaires coming together and discussing what they like to do, is AGI, the idea of artificial general intelligence. Now that discussion, as far as I can tell, I'm not an AI expert, nor do I play one on TV, but, there are discussions around these issues along with, AI ethics in China, but a lot more of it seems to be actually directed towards what the state would want, which is a much more heavily directed sense of growing the LLMs and other, algorithms which have been developed in commercial and also beyond that, state and military directions of utility. In other words, the sort of relative freedom of development that does still exist in the United States is less broad in China. I'm going to give a sort of overly simplistic statement, but why not? Feel free to pick it apart. There's an extent to which it's been clear that in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, powerful technologists, if you want to put it that way, in the United States have become more and more influential in government. I have a sense
Oh,
that
like
Chinese,
the technocrats, like those people.
yeah, of course, yeah, absolutely. Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and others. We've seen them, of course, the inauguration of the president. It was almost a sort of symbolic moment at which saying, look, tech is central to the way in which the administration and the ecology around it is defining itself. That's not what's happening in China. Yes, we have the big prominent tech CEOs. We have, the one who tends to be most famous in the West is Jack Ma, but he's just slightly out of the picture these days. He's around, but slightly sort of sidelined. But, Ma Huateng, Robert Lee, all these people who are basically running the big companies, Tencent, Baidu and others. Yes, they're visible, but when they're visible in public, it's made very clear that they are serving the party. The Xi Jinping makes it very clear that it is not going to be a scenario where the tech guys come around and tell the party and the government what to do. And that, I think, has directed the tech ecology in China in, much more the direction that the party, I think, wants to follow. If you think about another issue, which is, relevant as we're speaking here at the end of 2025, there's a lot of fear in the US stock market that there's maybe an AI tech stock boom happening, a boom that may turn to bust. Don't know if it's going to happen or not. We'll have to wait and see. That doesn't seem to be happening in China. And one of the reasons actually is that very high level, Chinese regulation of IPOs, the stock market, etc., is much, much more risk averse. It's much more cautious than it seems to be, in the US, which is the home of exuberance, the kind of animal spirits and everything in which people kind of, risk everything on the wheel of venture capital. So it may be that those kind of really wild blue skies inventions, the iPhone or whatever of the present era will still be much more likely to come out of Silicon Valley than they will out of China. But it may be that this more cautious but still innovative ecology within China then operationalizes and commercializes the existing technology by taking what exists, not inventing it, but taking what exists and then, multiplying it in terms of scale and in terms of scope and in terms of quality. Now, that's a competition of a sort, but it's not a direct either or A versus B type competition. It's almost as if we're talking about different niches.
Okay, I just wanted to say, after hearing that answer, I wish I had another hour with you, but I guess we'll have to make do with the time that we have.
Well, you've got plenty of time now, so feel free to come back on any of that. As I said, none of this is, all of this is still up for speculation in many ways. We're in a very, very fluid moment where the things that we might have said if we'd been doing this podcast a year ago would have been different from what we're saying now and will undoubtedly be different in a year from now.
Yeah, so I guess this is the part where I ask you a question where your answer will undoubtedly be different from what it would be a year from now. Do you think that we are living in the Chinese century, and also explain what that means?
I think we're living in a century where China will be increasingly important. I don't think we're living in a century where China will be the kind of globally dominant power, if that's what that's meant to mean. I think we're certainly moving into an era where actually probably no single great power or culture or system is going to be absolutely dominant. In fact, we can see that partly because the United States in the last year or so under the Trump administration has actually been moving towards, again, I don't know if they'd appreciate this, but I'll say it out loud. Some of the positions sound quite left-wing in a certain way. I don't think they define it that way, but if you look back to previous generations of people who argued that actually the United States had overextended its power, that it was seeking to intervene in other parts of the world where it shouldn't be, you can find aspects of that in protests against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Now, I'm not saying the intellectual origins of that worldview are the same from, let's say, the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society in the 1960s, and the MAGA movement of the 2020s. Obviously, they're not. But what it does show is that a worldview that has emerged is very, very different from the one that basically suggested the expansion of American power was the most important factor that would shape the Cold War and post-Cold War era. In that context, there is more space for China. But China, if it thinks it's going to be able to dominate that space, is going to have, I think, a big surprise. And to be fair, I think it's notable that China has been quite selective about the way in which it chooses to find a dominant position in certain areas. So if we're going to take your idea, Chinese century, I think you're pushing it, quite far. Who knows whether there even be podcasts in a century? But let's go for a decade. Is there going to be a Chinese decade? Well, I think the following things over the next decade, if there is no counter movement globally, are likely to see more domination by China. So number one will be energy transition. Because the United States has decided to essentially move against the idea of being a big investor in green tech, in essentially energy transition in a post-fossil fuel environment, it means that Chinese dominance in solar, in wind, in nuclear, which of course is also a non-fossil fuel technology, is going to become more dominant. And particularly, it's going to be a big deal in the emerging economies of the world that are going to be, I said a decade, so let's give ourselves a decade and a half. It's 2025 now. Let's say 2040. Who are the big players in terms of demography, populations in the world? So this goes back to your Chinese century point, which I'm reducing to a Chinese decade. In the year 2040, the most populous country in the world is going to be India. For that, we can be fairly sure because demographic extrapolation of populations doesn't move very, very fast. China will still be number two, big number two, but nonetheless fewer people in 15 years, notably, than India. That's because of the famous one-child policy that people will know about in part. And also because actually as countries get richer, they tend to have fewer kids. But then when you start going down the list of who are going to be the most populous countries in the world, you see it's like what used to be the kind of pop charts. I'm old enough to remember a thing called pop charts, where kind of numbers go up and down. And you're going to see a lot of new entries in that chart. Pakistan, Indonesia, I think India is going to hit in number 4. Nigeria, Democratic Republic of Congo. A lot of people didn't see that one coming, but that seems to be likely in the list. Japan, meanwhile, which is in the top 10 now, is going to probably have dropped out because its demographics are changing. Those countries are going to have growing middle classes. Those middle classes are going to want to have white collar jobs. They're going to want to have a lot of AI driven tech, which you mentioned before. That means big power farms power stations to run data farms. And that means for a lot of them, green energy. They can't afford to keep going fossil fuel direction because those countries are very vulnerable to climate change. So China has a message that it can get out in terms of where once it's installed its technology, it will be very hard to remove it. And the Western world at the moment is not providing a clear alternative on green energy. Same story with 5G. What's the reason that Brazil, Indonesia, a whole variety of countries are putting their 5G and then particularly beyond that 6G and 7G communications path dependency with Huawei or ZTE? Because the alternatives coming from the Western world, first of all, the US doesn't have a player in that market. That's quite remarkable. The other players are European, Ericsson and Nokia, Samsung from South Korea. But in terms of cost and speed, China's decided to take a loss leader position. It subsidizes its 5G very heavily. The Western world can and should complain about that, but it doesn't stop it being real. And once it's been installed, that's another area in terms of tech dominance where China is going to have an advantage for quite some time to come. I could go on with other areas, China international institutions, but I'm going to say if you're looking at where China has a built-in dominance that's emerging, don't look in places like, is China going to, sort of launch an army that's going to invade half of Asia? I think that's very, very, very unlikely for all sorts of reasons. Do look at questions of technology, energy, cyber, and the various spheres which are going to be dominant in the next decade and a half. In all those areas, you can make a very plausible case that the Chinese project is currently underway and the Western project is currently underpowered.
All right, I do want to hold on the energy part because I do think it's fascinating, like the extent to which China is trying to position itself in terms of renewable energy. So a few months ago, back when the US's Big Beautiful Bill was first passed, which is one of the bills that basically reneged on a lot of the subsidies for green energy from the Biden administration. There's this one journalist that I have a lot of respect for. His name is Derek Thompson, where he wrote something that I thought was so fascinating that I'm just going to quote it to you right now, wholesale.
Sure.
Quote, 3 decades ago, U.S. economists coined the idea of a resource curse to describe the historical irony that countries blessed with commodities like gold and silver remain trapped in the past, while nations without ample resources embraced new technology and grew faster. For example, resource-poor Netherlands eclipsed the Spanish Empire despite the latter's hauls of gold and silver. Now, consider the U.S. and China. The United States sits on a geological jackpot with easily accessible oil and gas reserves. On the other hand, China lacks sufficient oil or gas to power a billion-person economy, which is why it has spent decades trying to wean itself off foreign dependency by developing alternative energy sources. China wasn't blessed with America's hydrocarbon plenty. But which nation is the cursed one now? China dominates global manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, advanced batteries, electric vehicles, and the mining and processing of materials critical to the global clean energy economy. While the Trump administration pines for the energy policies of the past, China is racing toward the future. End quote. So what do you think of the idea that China might eclipse the U.S. economy within the next decade or two because of its willingness to transition to green energy to a greater extent than the U.S.?
Well, again, that's a really interesting comparison. I have to look up that particular journalist in this quote. Very, very interesting. I think there's a couple of notes of caution I would put forward, though, on the scenario put forward. First of all, in terms of the literal question of whether or not China's economy will surpass that of the United States, a lot of people were saying that even 2, 3, 4 years ago. I have my doubts at the moment. I mean, right now, the Chinese economy is not firing on all cylinders, and the kind of spectacular growth rates that we saw in the 1990s and 2000s have been plateauing off for a while. COVID, as with much of the rest of the world, did a great deal to flatten them further. They are not recovering at the rates that a lot of people, including, I think, planners in China, had expected. So, and the US economy certainly continues to grow in all sorts of areas, even though some of it may be fueled by that AI boom that we mentioned before. So I wouldn't be putting my money on the Chinese economy being kind of, on a GDP basis, larger than that of the US anytime very, very soon. But let's take that wider point about resource curse. And again, more recently, people have used examples of Middle Eastern countries that have huge amounts of oil, but didn't end up using them necessarily in ways that move the society on beyond the rentier economy. So I would say that looking at the China story, and I've just done this myself, to be fair, so, through the green economy lens, is insufficient. Go back to that question that you raised, through the quotation of energy, why China can dominate in the green energy sphere, solar panels, wind turbines. Well, the fact is that China can manufacture these things at very, very low cost because A, it heavily subsidizes them, but B, its environmental conditions are such that it can manufacture in ways that no advanced country would nowadays tolerate. The United States, yes, is currently in a moment where a lot of prominent people, the Trump administration, say we should go back to the 1950s. I don't think even the Trump administration, they're not necessarily environmental activists, but even they, I think, are not going to go back to the days when in the 50s and 60s you had huge kind of belching pollution all across the Midwest, all across the industrial cities of the United States. Smog, which is no longer really an issue in US cities, was absolutely a factor in the 60s and 70s. Industrial Japan, the same thing as well. Used to have lots of debates in 1960s Tokyo about whether or not, it was a good or bad thing that policemen standing in traffic circles couldn't see more than about 4 or 5 feet in front of their faces because the smog was so bad. So going back to those days as the price for being able to manufacture at China's scale and cost seems to be a price that no democratic voting public is likely to embrace. And the irony that China's prominence in green tech production comes in large part because of its huge environmental pollution is notable. A lot of things in life are ironic, but there is, I think, also in that a very clear explanation of why it is, A, that continue on the present path is not necessarily going to help China if it doesn't move more comprehensively to cleaner production. And, it's still opening huge numbers of coal-fired power stations and all sorts of other things too. And whether or not you enter an ironic situation where China is exporting green tech to other countries that therefore are able to mitigate climate change as a result, maybe in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, but ends up polluting massively at home on the grounds that that's where the manufacturing is going on, largely because they're following actually the, a version of the current US administration's mindset that manufacturing at home and creating blue-collar jobs is more of a priority than dealing with environmental issues, assuming, not everyone would assume this, but assuming that the two are in opposition to each other.
Okay, there's so much to unpack there, but I'll stick with one at a time. I think that you were definitely correct when you talked about how people were predicting like China eclipsing the US like even 3 or 4 years ago. I would go even further that they were predicting that like 9 years ago. So I'm gonna make another quote, and then after I quote it, I'm gonna tell you who it was from. This was an article that was published in December 2016. Quote, Donald Trump's evolution from a buffoonish fringe candidate taken seriously by no one to the president-elect of the United States is one of the most unexpected and traumatic events in recent U.S. history. The effects are uncertain, but in the worst case, they could lead to the U.S. giving up entirely on global leadership and the unraveling of the liberal world order it has done much to build since the 1950s. And then, much later on in the article, after the George W. Bush era had painfully exposed the limits of America's military might in Iraq, the Barack Obama years saw China knock America off the top spot as the world's largest economy on one measure, and it looks all set to overtake it entirely within a few years, end quote. So this was written like a month after Donald Trump was first elected president back in like 2016. You know who wrote this? This was written by like Francis Fukuyama of all people. Like the idea that China was going to like completely eclipse the US is something that people have been like predicting for over a decade at this point. So do you think that maybe there's like a little bit of a prematureness in terms of people predicting the extent to which China will outpace the US? And maybe I do wonder how much of it is a product of us sort of including people who tout democracy far more than other people. Even us tend to underestimate how like resilient democratic economies tend to be compared to authoritarian economies. What would you say to that argument?
Well, the latter point, I absolutely agree with you. I think we do underestimate democratic resilience. And actually, that is one of the great flaws of democracies. They need to believe in themselves more than they do. And I think that's true in Western Europe, North America, East Asia, and all around the world. I mean, as you've already gathered from my previous answers, I'm not necessarily a purchaser, if you want to say, people are selling the idea. I'm not necessarily buying the idea that China is going to become dominant in any sense. I think we're heading for a world in which power is more divided and dissipated between different poles. But the idea that the United States is going to disappear as a global actor, I think, is for the birds. I mean, it's clearly tremendously important. And actually, if you look at, again, recently, I mean, we're speaking again in December 2025, there's been a lot of talk in the last few days about a document that's emerged, which is the national security strategy of the Trump administration, which has really downplayed and been very critical of Europe. But actually, if you look at what it says about Asia, in some ways, it's quite traditional, you might say. I mean, yes, it is saying that there should be, a kind of careful calibration, calculation of what it is that the US is doing in Asia. But that said, its position on Taiwan, very controversial issue, of course, and one on which there's been a lot of speculation, doesn't seem to be particularly, massively out of kilter with what previous administration, including Trump 1, would have said about that. And also the wider sense that understanding that the American interests in the Asia Pacific are similar to those of its allies and partners is still very, very visible. I mean, I would also say that my own sense of such documents is that they are never written by one person, any more than the Chinese equivalents are as well. They come out of committees, so you can see an awful lot of hands in these areas. But I think I would both acknowledge that there have been very significant changes in the way in which the US chooses to define leadership in the world. And I think Europe is the most obvious area where there's been a significant change, at the very least in language. But language matters, particularly when you're dealing with an active war situation with Russia, Ukraine, and where actually the vibe may seem different, but maybe in practice isn't so much. And there I'm thinking about Asia. So I would differentiate out, how each different part of the world is regarded in terms of that question of US leadership.
Do you think that in general, all of the people who are very bullish on China's economy in the next decade or two, maybe they are drastically underestimating the negative effects that the China's one-child policy has had and will continue to have on its economy over the next few decades? Would you agree with that statement?
I'm not sure the one-child policy is necessarily the biggest drag. I mean, I think the main problem. I mean, if I knew what the Chinese economy really was going to do, I'd be very rich. And I can assure your listeners I am not very rich. But I would say that there are so many imponderable factors at the moment that trying to project, China or indeed the US economy beyond a certain point is just really hard to do. I mean, let me tell you the things that I would like to have a definitive answer on I can't give you. One, as with the US economy or the European economy, what actually will be the economic effects of AI? Clearly it's becoming more and more widespread within China, high level of technology. So what will the effects be? The one thing I can't see at the moment is how it creates jobs. So maybe that doesn't matter because, the jobs will be created elsewhere. But right now I don't get a good answer to that question. Without knowing about the labor market, you can't really make, I think, a meaningful projection about the economy. Then there's a question of some things we can predict. Where is the Chinese economy going to change in terms of its basic nature in the next few years? Well, one thing that's been advocated for 20, 25 years, Chinese government, CCP, always says this, hasn't yet done it, is a massive shift towards domestic consumption to basically try and boost the economy. And essentially, that's not really possible to do at the same time as it continues to try and push a really heavy global export surplus, which it still maintains. But I think that and this goes to your one-child policy issue, I think demographic changes are beginning to force a different policy because as China becomes older, faster, and not now, not next year, not even next decade, but within the next couple of decades, we see that the proportion of people aged over 60 goes up, and the proportion of people aged, 20 or plus is relatively speaking going down. The economy will have to change as it already has done in other countries in Asia and beyond to accommodate an older population. What's that meant in South Korea, Japan, Germany? It spent more money spent on healthcare. Now, I can't remember the exact figures. I should have them to hand, but the proportion of American GDP that's spent on healthcare is like 15% or something. It's some huge amount. The point is that China is going to have more older middle class people who are going to expect, if not the healthcare levels that you get in an absolute kind of developed rich country like Japan, nonetheless much better than what their parents or their grandparents sort of accepted just a few years ago. And that costs. MRIs cost, drugs cost, hip replacements cost. How's it going to be paid for? Social insurance? Well, China doesn't really have a very developed system of social insurance. Healthcare over the counter costs. Well, the US shows an example of why that doesn't necessarily work very well. This is, if I had to take a bet, I don't have to take a bet, but if I did, on where there's going to be massive sectoral change and reform in the next few years in China, I would go for healthcare because it's clearly one of the most under-addressed but imminent issues of social change that's there right now. And that's an effect that will be huge within the economy. Beyond that, I'd say also we haven't yet seen the full effects of China's property boom collapsing, with the increase in credit that came particularly after the world economic crisis 2008. China had a decade and a half of actually in some ways quite well spent overall investment. I'm going to be controversial and say that, not all of it was bad. High-speed trains, a lot of new buildings, roads, airports. China needed a lot of this stuff, and it now has excellent infrastructure. Many people, I think, listening to this will have read the New York Times best-selling book by Dan Lang called Breakneck, which makes this slightly tongue-in-cheek point that America's full of lawyers and China's full of engineers. Now, in both cases, I think you can obviously question that a bit. But, the amount of building and engineering going on in China the last 15 years shows that capital was spent in some ways effectively. But that has kind of come to an end. And because of the demographics, which is where we started with this, there's going to be fewer and fewer young families who need apartments to live in. Many of those buildings that were built, have become almost kind of ghost cities in some cases. In other words, the property boom that fueled a lot of China's economy for 15 years, that won't work again. Is AI going to be the replacement? We don't know yet. But in all those areas, there are so many uncertainties that I would be unwilling to make a real bet on what the size of the economy is going to be. It may be, as it has done so many times before, that China finds a way out of it, but we don't yet have a clear picture, I think, of what that way out is going to be.
Yeah, and I guess it is kind of I'm sure it is sometimes unsatisfying to just know that a lot of the time the right answer to a lot of these questions about like how China's economy will compare to other world economies is just that there's a lot of uncertainty and we don't really know because of how like to quote Yoda, always in motion is the future. And that like nowhere is that more evident than just like trying to figure out China's future trajectory. We talked a lot about the Chinese economy. Maybe it would be worth it to talk about Chinese culture a little bit and how it differs from like many other Western cultures. So like I haven't told you this yet, but I'm an ABC or like an American born Chinese.
Okay.
So to me it's very fascinating to understand like the ways in which Chinese culture differs from a lot of different Western cultures, particularly American culture. Like if you were to think of the idea of the American dream, something that many people, some of them believe in, some of them like deconstruct or disbelieve in. But there is this idea within America that like if you work hard, then like it'll bear fruit for you and you'll succeed. But I guess then the question is like, how much overlap do you think there is between like the Chinese like cultural idea of meritocracy from like a lot of the Western ideas of like how to succeed in life?
Um, I think in recent years, the answer is that there's quite a lot of overlap. I absolutely recognize that kind of American dream model you put forward. And, one of the kind of great issues in American politics today, as you know, is that many people feel disillusioned that, they did their bit, they worked hard, they played by the rules. And for whatever reason, their comfortable lifestyle has not, come to be. And actually, you see that more and more in China as well. One of the terms that was very prominent a few years ago, maybe even now, I think actually in bits of Chinese social media is "fangnu," the idea of being a mortgage slave. In other words, so much of your disposable income is spent on trying to pay for your property that you don't have actually much money to spend on anything else. And the idea of rising property prices and rental prices in cities around the world is true in New York and Chicago and London and Paris, but it's also true in Beijing, Shanghai, and Chongqing as well. So, this is a phenomenon where China is very similar to the US and elsewhere. In terms of that question of, the drive to succeed, I think that there is a longer history of that and a present around that in China that people don't often realize. If you go to the back, I haven't been for a little while now. I should have probably gone my last trip, but I've been in the last few years into bookstores in China, and I've been intrigued to see that there's usually a section in the bigger, more popular ones for what is just called 成功学, success studies. In other words, the idea that you can buy books that will tell you about how to kind of be an inspiring entrepreneur who will make your fortune. I believe that the biography of Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson, which was translated to Chinese, was one of the best-selling books in, kind of Chinese recent book selling history. So taking on some of that sort of idea of entrepreneurial success does have a place in the present day. Of course, it didn't exist in Mao's China or in the Cultural Revolution in quite that sort of a way, because it would have seen as being part of kind of a capitalist vibe. But if you go to the period that I'm a specialist historian on, the Republic, which is the 1920s and 30s, there's lots and lots of that. Zhou Taofen, who was one of the best-known journalists of the 20s and 30s operating out of Shanghai, wrote frequently columns and, kind of advice pieces about how to take advantage of the new kind of social and economic opportunities that came from opening up to the wider world that existed in China in that early period, just about a century ago. And many of them had to do with seeking inspiration from entrepreneurship, including figures like Thomas Edison in the United States. So I would say that vibe maybe isn't so different in China today. And also, it's not something that was just invented 5 minutes ago. It does have that longer history. In terms of meritocracy, I mean, many people will know, just worth noting, that China, for many years, about 1,000 years from the Song dynasty until 1905, maintained a system of official examinations to enter the bureaucracy. Some ways people say it's been sort of reproduced, not quite, but in some ways in the present day by the famous and much feared Gaokao, the high school graduation exam, which operates nationally in China, which will define your chance of either getting to a top university or maybe having to kind of go somewhere not so top tier. And it's a real life defining moment for many, many people in China. Those elements of examination have, it's true, been very culturally distinct in China for a long time. I think that's absolutely fair to say. But I would say that in some ways that sits almost at right angles to the entrepreneurial part. Even today, there's a sense that you either take a bureaucratic track and you take a sort of safe government job where your pay won't be great, but it's quite difficult to get fired, or that you 下海, you jump into the sea of commerce and entrepreneurship, and then you're taking risks, but that's also the arena in which you might make a huge fortune. And both of those strands exist at the same time.
So maybe that's one like subtle difference between Chinese culture and American culture, is that like in American culture, a lot of the like prizing risk taking and entrepreneurship and like prizing working hard to succeed. There are a lot of ways in which those two are seen as like going hand in hand and not really incompatible with each other in the US compared to China. Maybe part of the reason why China views those things as like at a right angle to each other is because China is a more collectivist and less individualistic society. Would you agree with that premise?
Not entirely, no. I mean, I would say that overall, a variety of the ethical and political systems that have shaped China over many millennia do have a more collectivist air, Confucianism, being a kind of shorthand for a variety of pre-modern philosophical traditions. And obviously there's a collective element in Marxism-Leninism as well, which of course has dominated the Communist Party. That said, if you look at the Confucian tradition, there is also a great deal of concentration on the cultivation of the self. If you think about ideas like xiushan, sort of personal kind of self-reflection and self-cultivation, that's very much about thinking about who you are. Or a famous so there's a famous TV series in China 4 or 5 years ago about three 30-something women called 30而已, 30 nothing, or nothing but 30. And it was a play on a Confucian saying, which I think is quite well known, 30而立. At the age of 30, I took my stand. In other words, deciding that once you've reached an age of, the first stage of wisdom, 30 in this particular case, you can actually, you have the right, you have the authority to be able to decide certain things about your own ethical stance. Those seem to me very much products of a society in which understanding the nature of the self, yes, of course, how it fits into a kind of hierarchical collective whole, but nonetheless not one that is simply absorbed into some kind of mass, is very important. And I would say that if you look at the way in which Chinese, popular culture and society has emerged in the period from the 1990s onwards, there's still a very strong element of individualism. I remember one advertising slogan a few years ago for, I think, a brand of jeans, or actually, no, I think it was a soft drink or something, but it was 与众不同. In other words, not the same as the masses. That struck me as being a slightly cheeky, but actually quite effective way of marketing in China, saying that actually, the individual does matter. Or that particular case, I have to say that buying the same soda as millions of other people was not necessarily a sign of particularly strong individualism. But then blue jeans have always been sold in the United States on the grounds that wearing the same clothes as everyone else will make you into a rugged individual.
All right, maybe I'll test another theory on you because I want to hear your thoughts on this. Maybe compared to American culture, like Chinese culture, there's still a lot of focus on like the self. But when there is a focus on the self, there's less of a prioritization on like concepts such as freedom or egalitarianism. Would you agree with that?
I think that there is an element of truth to that, but only an element which draws actually as much as anything from historical circumstance. China has been a place that has been very, very racked by warfare and revolution, certainly in the last 100, 150 years, and even in the period beyond that. And societies which have been very touched by war and revolution tend to value order as a particular good on the grounds that they have had very little of it in their day-to-day life. It's notable that really, if you want to define it, broadly speaking, from, say, the turn of the 20th century, say 1900, which is the Boxer War, all the way up to, let us say, about 1980 or so, China was in the middle of either an international or a domestic war at pretty much every moment of those 80 years. Civil wars, the war against the Japanese, World War II, the war with Vietnam in 1979. And since 1980 or so, to be fair, China has not been engaged in international conflicts. But the memory of that earlier period is still very much with us. I didn't even mention the Cultural Revolution, which you could certainly regard as a very violent internal civil war of a sort. That's very different from the American situation, where broadly speaking, and with huge exceptions such as the American Civil War, but broadly speaking, the country has been relatively stable domestically. People have had the space to think about the wider issues of, freedom and being able to operate on a more individuated basis. But even in that context, I would just point out, as I have pointed out various occasions, that in 1947-48, when the newly emergent post-war order is emerging, one of the most prominent writers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, including individual civil liberties, is a Chinese philosopher, P.H. Zhang.
All right. Final question. Let's say that there was someone listening to this podcast where you ended up piquing their interest in understanding Chinese politics and culture far more, and they want to find ways to do more research and understand more about China. Where would you recommend that they begin?
Well, Andrew, I have to say, of course, the first place to go is the just published third edition of my own book, Modern China, a very short introduction, just out from Oxford University Press. But broadly speaking, beyond that, that'd be, I think, a starting point I'd be happy to have people go to. There are, places on the web, and there are books and films and so forth that I think can give people all sorts of ways into this wider question. I'll mention one other resource. I mean, there are many out there, but I'll mention one that has become, I think, really powerful and useful, which is the China Books Review, free on my website from the Asia Society of New York. Now, it does review books, but a bit like the New York Review of Books, it doesn't just review books. It also does long essays about Chinese politics, Chinese culture, Chinese history, and gives also kind of clues as to where to go to deepen your knowledge as well. So that would also, I think, be a great place for people to go to find out more about China, broadly speaking.
Rana Mitter, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Pleasure to be with you, Andrew. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.